Hello and welcome. I'm Adriana Farmiga, artist, faculty member, and associate dean here at the School of Art at the Cooper Union. Thank you all for joining us. We are thrilled to be continuing our series of public art fund talks at the Cooper Union and to be hosting this event, in spite of not being able to gather in person or on campus. Both Cooper Union and Public Art Fund share in a mission of bringing important conversations about the power of creative expression to a broad public. And one benefit of this virtual format is that it allows us to reach audiences wherever they are. So hello, wherever that is for you. Tonight, we continue with the second of a two-part discussion that we began last month on the role of art in the time of crisis. This is a topic that bears on the many critical and intersecting challenges currently facing our city and the world, from the devastation of a global pandemic to the systemic and ongoing violence committed against Black lives, Indigenous peoples, and communities of color. Our conversation this evening centers around Public Art Fund's Art on the Grid, an exhibition for which I served on the nominating committee. I was honored to be part of this exhibition and to have the opportunity to suggest some of the emerging voices in New York City who could respond and help process this extraordinary time through their work. Tonight, we are joined by a few of these artists, one of whom I'm proud to say is a Cooper alumna. In just a moment, they will talk about their work and share their reflections on how engaging different histories, genres of iconography, and representation generate dialogues that both acknowledge and look beyond our dysfunctional present. My thanks to the Public Art Fund for partnering with Cooper Union and making this series possible. Thank you again to all of our virtual attendees and our featured artists. Now it is my pleasure to welcome Public Art Fund's Director and Chief Curator, Nicholas Baume, who will introduce tonight's featured speakers. Nicholas has curated more than 50 exhibitions with a wide range of international artists at different stages of their careers. He has been with the Public Art Fund since 2009, previously serving as curator at institutions like Caldor Public Art Projects, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney, the Wadsworth Athenaeum, and more recently, Boston's Institute of Contemporary Art. Nicholas, I'll hand things over to you.
Thanks so much, Adriana. Wonderful to see you. Wonderful to be back at virtual Cooper Union talks. And thank you again for your participation in being a part of our nominated group for Art on the Grid. We really value the partnership that we have with Cooper Union, and am excited to be able to continue virtually this fall. And Public Art Fund and Cooper Union, with their mutual commitment to the public sphere, to art, to democratic access to art and culture, are very natural partners. So thank you. I want to also say a word of thanks to, of course, the supporters that have made this series, our Public Art Fund Talks, possible. Con Edison, the New York State Council on the Arts, and New York City's Department of Cultural Affairs. We're grateful to all of you for supporting this public program, which, like everything we do, is free. I also want to thank the very many donors who got on board and got behind making the exhibition Art on the Grid possible. In particular, I want to thank those exhibition sponsors that are joining us this evening, or this afternoon. I guess it's still really bright and sunny, beautiful day here in New York. So a big thanks to Bloomberg Philanthropies and to members of our board, including Ellen Shelley, Elizabeth Fearon-Pepperman, Jennifer New, and Patty Silverstein. Also want to thank our extraordinary partners on the exhibition, JC Deco and NYC and Company, really an amazing partnership to make the exhibition possible. So let me dive in to talk a little bit, maybe just to lay out the plan for how the talk is going to proceed. First, let me just acknowledge that Adam Khalil, who was to be one of the participants today, was not able to join us. And Adam sends his apologies. I'm disappointed that he's not with us, but he has probably the best excuse that anyone's ever given me for missing something like this. And in fact, Adam got married today. So his partner is Danish. They were, because of the pandemic, separated for 4+ months. He's currently in Denmark, and because of various logistical and administrative and visa things and all the rest of it, but most of all because they're totally in love, they decided on the weekend to get married. So instead of being at this talk, he's gone on his honeymoon. So congratulations to Adam. We'll have him back here another time. Adam, of course, is an artist and a filmmaker and a member of the Ojibwe tribe. And I think the diversity of inclusion of artists in this show is one of the things that was important to us in putting it together. And in that way, it really reflects the nature of the art community in New York City. When I have said a few words about the exhibition in general, I'll introduce our speakers. Firelei Báez, who'll talk about her work, followed by D'Angelo Lovell Williams, who'll share a bit about his practice, and then we'll open it up to discussion. And we'll also, I hope, have time for some audience questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A button, and as opposed to the chat function, and then we'll be able to see your question. Okay, so let me talk a little bit just about the exhibition Art on the Grid. And maybe, Miranda, you could show some of the images. And this is just sort of a selection of images in the exhibition as they're installed. And I think, we've all sought in our experience over the past, 6 months, silver linings to what we've all been through. And for me, this exhibition is one of those. And it really was only possible because advertising space in the immediate sort of aftermath of the pandemic, in particular, outdoor advertising, since people were being asked to stay home, was suddenly not being used. And we have a fantastic partnership on an ongoing basis with JC Deco. And in talking to them, we realized that there was an opportunity to perhaps use advertising space on a bigger scale. And in talking with them and NYC and Co., which loved the idea, that we really could take, say, 500 bus shelters throughout New York City, every borough, and give that space to artists and really turn the outdoor space into something of a gallery, when we were seeing all of our typical interior gallery spaces closed and no longer accessible. So So this really prompted us to sort of think about the exhibition very differently than we would normally think of an exhibition. For one thing, it was very rapid response. And that was partly because the opportunity to use so many of these spaces that were normally for outdoor advertising was available for a very limited time. So it was basically, we can do this, but it has to be, ASAP. We also then, thinking about the way we normally work, Public Art Fund's program, is very global, and we work with artists from all over the world, including the United States and New York, of course. But we would never normally do an exhibition that was purely New York artists. But we decided to do that because it really, I think we were all in a moment where we were very much in the eye of the storm, going through this sort of terrible pandemic. It was affecting our own community in a very immediate way. And we felt like this exhibition could be a very important way for our own community to reflect on, for the artists in our community to reflect on and share their experience. So we decided to work with 50 New York-based artists, also a much bigger number, I think the biggest number of artists ever in a sort of single simultaneous Public Art Fund exhibition. And we also thought about the methodology for selecting the artists a little bit differently. We realized, given the very compressed time frame, one, that if we wanted to really reflect the artistic community of New York, that we wanted to draw on that community to help us sort of identify artists for the show. So we ended up receiving nominations from 32 different members of the art community, fellow curators, educators, artists, people involved that could expand the field of knowledge that we had. And when I say we, I mean myself and two other Public Art Fund curators, Dan Palmer and Katerina Stopathulu, who together sort of worked on reviewing all of these nominations and then coming up with the 50 artists that ultimately made work for the exhibition. Also very unusual for us to have such a specific thematic focus, but we really wanted artists to reflect on this moment of crisis that we were in. We didn't, of course, we knew that those reflections would be very different, and that we wanted to have artists feel free to work in different mediums, different approaches, but it had to be a very specific format. That is to say, it had to work on the format of the bus shelter advertising space and the Link NYC digital kiosks, which were also a key part of the exhibition display platform. So in some ways, it was sort of a very unusually specific directive kind of exhibition for Public Art Fund, and artists had a very short space of time to respond. So a really interesting learning process for us, and one that I think certainly caused us to really rethink and reinvent how we were working. So the thematic terrain that I think the artists sort of worked in, we initially understood as sort of the pandemic, the health crisis. But of course, that very quickly sort of became layered with other crises, with the killing of George Floyd, the crisis of systemic racism and police violence against Black people, the BIPOC community, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and actually the recognition of the structural inequalities that that really were underlined by those events. Access to healthcare, safe working conditions, economic disadvantage, the climate crisis, and all of these things playing out against a backdrop of deep political division and renewed activism and demands for change. So in thinking about this talk, excavating the past, confronting the present, imagining the future, we were thinking, actually when we invited the artists, we were thinking about the present and the future when we wrote to artists and flagged those as things they might think about. We hadn't really talked so much about the past, but I was struck by how many of the artists in their work referenced historical motifs or themes in different ways. National and regional symbols, the United States flag, bald eagle, the seal of New York City, of the state of New York, monuments, the Statue of Liberty. It made me conscious of how much discussion of the systemic nature of the present layered crises had demanded a deeper understanding of how we got to where we are. And that's a thread that runs through so many works in the exhibition. There are histories of iconography, layers of thematic and art historical reference in so many of the works, some apparent and some more coded and layered. So, so I'd love to introduce now the artists that we have joining us. First of all, Firelei Báez. Pharrelli's an extraordinary artist, rendering subjects in complex layers of pattern and imagery, casting cultural and regional histories into an imaginative realm where visual references drawn from the past are reconfigured to explore new possibilities for the future. Pharrelli received an MFA for Hunter College and, of course, a BFA from Cooper Union. Pharrelli, I'm very happy, will be the subject of a solo presentation at my alma mater museum, the ICA Watershed in Boston in next year. And in 2019, the artist Pharrelli's work was the subject of a solo at the Manello Museum of Art in Orlando, Florida, the Witte de Wit in Rotterdam, and the Modern Window at the Museum of Modern Art, New York. So Pharrelli, your work in the show is on rest and resistance because we love you, to all those stolen from among us. And so glad you're here and look forward to hearing about your work.
Thank you so much, Nick and team, for inviting me. I will very quickly go through my work. I didn't realize that even in Zoom, I'd still be nervous doing these talks, so please bear with me. Quick shout out before I even start. I'd like to have everybody look at the NAP Ministry. They are a really great platform on alternate ways of resisting and how to really question the systems that got us to the present. So even if you just go into Instagram, go look at the NAP Ministry. And with that in mind, that segues into my work. This particular installation was from my first show at James Cohen Gallery. Actually, no, this is the installation at the Vit, where I will, through installation and abstraction and painting, reference very concrete histories. But the main goal is to anchor the viewer to the present and to the body. So this very welcoming and close space can be an anchor point to let you access things like the night at the onset of the Haitian Revolution. It's a geospecific snapshot of the night sky above the town where the ceremony that sparked the revolution took place, and taking that particular moment as a nexus for other things that we take for granted or that history has skewed towards maybe not full truths. So when we take ideas of progress and modernity and Americana, we don't take how this particular moment dictated or was created a domino effect for many future actions. So then the symbols embedded into it reference, give you a way of accessing all those different histories and maybe recontextualizing the present and where we are, whether it's in the Netherlands or in the American South or the Northeast. And in that same way, I like, for someone who loves painting as much as I do and figuration, I'm always suspect. I'm a big questioning of the illusory nature of painting. I don't want to make it entirely just this window for escape. So something like this figure, for instance, I'd like to always go back to the foundational stories that were taught to me as warnings or things of what not to be. So growing up, I was always taught of these creatures called ciguapas, and they're one of the very few female tricksters that you see globally. Trickster figures are usually gendered male, but she was this creature of nature that had limitless power and was able to break karmic loads of many generations. So what better figure to look back or to break the karmic load of many of these inherited histories? She's centered on this map, which was a children's game from the 1700s that was teaching children how to move from the outer layers to the center, meaning Egypt, Mexico, Hispaniola, to the center, which was France and England. So how to refract that? How do you, taking, given the histories that we've been, that have been articulated and have formed us, how do you look back? So then having that same figure stand over the island of Hispaniola, one of the very first maps, and recalibrate it. This is the Windward Passage. So unlike many other maps that are supposed to be actually specific to the landscape, a lot of maps of the Caribbean are almost like storytelling. They're very fictive and they prioritize usually mercantile interests. So Caicos, which is a little tiny island, will become much bigger because it held a bank than something like Cuba, which was maybe 10 times its size or much more than that. So this figure is centrally placed there to allow you to question. And I could go on about the gesture of the figuration, the duck walk, the way that she's flowing. But we can move forward to the next slide, which is other versions of, and what are using that gesture again to think of moments of intimacy and healing, which, a lot of times the same figures that are marginalized and put are seen as not necessarily desirable, how they end up really reconfiguring what we think of as beautiful. So slowly eroding that center till we make something beautiful of our own, which if we go on to the next slide, which is a Plath image, again, how individual gestures, how really rethinking resistance, that we are so taught to think of resistance as something that is externalized always. And so for this piece, I was looking at an image of freedom riders at rest in a pew in church. It's an image that's been disseminated a lot, but there's one pew, it's an intergenerational image that's really beautiful. It's like older women and younger women just resting and thinking of how important that is, how without that moment of boosting up, you cannot be ready for war. It's a war that's meant to defeat you ultimately if you don't hold your own. So she is holding this, the figure in this painting becomes almost an amalgamation of an entire row of the young women that are in a pew. And she's at this moment of regenerative rest, reading this book that is so uncannily like the present. It's a novel by Octavia Butler called Parable of the Sower, where it is at a moment of American economic collapse, environmental collapse. And this small group of people band together, led by this one young Black woman who is able to, through her connection to nature and her aspirations for human potential, which to her is outer space, able to regenerate, to make these different spaces that are outside of these oppressive histories. And I just really love the idea that, you know, you can have what seems like an extremely destructive, chaotic, to make something healing, to make something, to take a moment of self-definition outside of what seems like a completely collapsed system. And during COVID isolation, it seemed like it was something that poured out of me to make. It was almost like a guilty pleasure. And it was very tricky to crop for the path display, which if we go to the next slide, you can kind of see how it became further abstracted by splicing it as a vertical. And for some people, it was hard to even find the figure to begin with. And then when you located the book and you located her eyes looking back at you, then that became a different experience. But because it's also printed as a very dark image, it almost became a mirror. So your face could be part of the figure. Your body became part of the figure of in the work itself.
Thank you so much, Pharrelli. Lots to think about and sort of come back to as well. And but what I'd love to do right now is introduce D'Angelo. D'Angelo's an artist exploring narratives of Black and queer intimacy through photography. They earned their BFA in photography from Memphis College of Art and an MFA in photography from Syracuse. Their work has been featured in Dazed, W Magazine, the New York Times, Out Magazine, His Kind, Musée Magazine, Newspaper Magazine, Strange Fire Collective. D'Angelo has exhibited at Higher Pictures, the Mint Museum, Yale University Art Gallery, the Pingyao International Photography Festival in China, Black Box Gallery, and the Center for Fine Art Photography. His image for Art on the Grid is called Undetectable. And D'Angelo, I'm thrilled that you're here with us today and would love you to tell us a little about the work.
Yes, thank you for having me. Welcome to everyone participating. When I got to grad school in Syracuse, I, of course, I knew I was going to be in a photography program for the next 3 years, but I didn't quite know exactly what I would be spending the next 3 years doing. And I remember all that I used to, think about making images of in undergrad. I was photographing my body a lot. And my inspiration for that was a lack of representation of what I was seeing growing up, whether that was in film, media, books. And a lot of it had to do with the reflection of Black life and the narrative surrounding that. And it was a lot of things that were being discovered through my own body, my Blackness, my queerness. And I was wanting all of that to be a part of my image making. So the images included here are some images that are kind of where I've started to include more intimate, what the gist of my work is about, intimacy between queer Black men, family. There's a lot of touch, a lot of hands, gestures that kind of reference these points in history in order to kind of continue conversations that have either been overlooked or narratives that have been overlooked as it pertains to Black and queer life. So I kind of reference these, I consider time to be kind of simultaneous, past, present, future. And I see images as portals into moments outside of what we would consider time to be. And I use aesthetically things that, I can put into an image. Like I love film, so my images tend to look more cinematic. Film and cinema, I love music. I try to use song lyrics or kind of these narrative parts of something that doesn't necessarily or might not have a visual to reference these things throughout history. And I will use titles and the parts of images that I use to kind of continue these conversations. This image here is called Until We Separate. This is my mother and I, we're chewing the same piece of gum. And it's used to reference, the piece of gum is used to reference the umbilical cord. This is a typical mother-child image, and I use it to talk about the relationship between specifically Black men, Black queer men, and their mothers or family, being seen with them, because there are a lot of situations where some people who identify as queer, gay, part of the LGBT community, trans, non-binary, don't have relationships with their families. So to talk about why that is, we need to see more images of family and queer life and the two blending together. So what I do want to continue to do as far as making images of Black and queer life is to show this, I would say, a destigmatized connection between the people in the images to what is reflective of my lived experience and other Black and queer people's experiences with each other, outside of what may be considered overtly sexual. A lot of my images contain nudity, and the people in the images are interacting with each other through these gestures, through this performativity of the body that is pretty late as far as I'm referencing history as we know it. I'm referencing what I'm wanting to see in the future, and I'm referencing what is happening presently. As we look at images, as we're being given images to archive of Black people, queer people, and our lives and narratives. So there are points that I have wanted to make with images that weren't necessarily the easiest to do, as far as when I'm introducing people into my work with me, I'm wanting to, you know, represent the other people. I'm wanting them to be comfortable. And I sometimes get questions about like images that I do put out into the world and them being difficult to be viewed by an audience. And I overlook the, what I would say is like it's a limit on a narrative that someone who may be white or privileged have not had to have. There's so much trauma that's in Black blood already. So it's like any image that I want to create that's based on my experience or someone else's that may have been traumatic, could be, I would say it could be just like words like queer, or fag, or all of these words that have been reclaimed by the communities that they were used to harm. I feel the same can be done with image making. And I wanted to continue like the language that I was having to create to talk about the images that I was making in school and having to continue to do outside of school when I made the public art plan image that I titled Undetectable, which is a reference to being HIV positive and went on meds taking safely, becoming undetectable. But again, the layering of like the themes and the meanings in images that I make, I'm using the word undetectable as one to talk about HIV diagnoses and consistent health in that journey, because it is quite a journey. But I'm also wanting to talk about the undetectability of COVID-19 through the use of the smoke as a visual in this particular image, as well as using the masks to reference something that is more common to all of us these days. And the smoke is also something that we can see visually. And here I'm showing two figures embrace in a romantic kiss through all of the kind of precautionary measures that we would take just living our daily lives. Here's an installation shot of that. But I definitely thought about a number of ways to try to get certain ideas across that touched on our experiences collectively throughout history and dealing with a pandemic, multiple pandemics, but also destigmatizing the language surrounding HIV and AIDS and Black and queer life. And I thought it was just a great way to mesh all of that together.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much, D'Angelo. So love to sort of have some conversation with both you and Pharrelli, and also just to audience members, if you would like to send any questions, please do that to the Q&A portal. I guess it strikes me that both of you, I mean, D'Angelo, you literally use the word, romantic. It's a romantic image. in a very sort of direct sense. Pharrelli, your image might also be thought of as romantic. You're romantic in that sense of the solitary figure going inside into their own imaginative world, somehow, you know, there, but also inaccessible because within this world of their own imagination, whether it's through literature, there's that one eye peeping out from the mass of curls. It's interesting to me that both of you, you know, in the context of crisis, want to make space for and in a sense, you know, present beautiful romantic images. Not that they don't have an edge as well, but I think it's kind of interesting to reflect on sort of why you felt that impulse.
Yeah.
You want to go first, D'Angelo?
Sure. One, I was dating this person in the image, and it felt like if it wasn't me, it was going to be someone else in a similar situation that I was thinking of. But I wanted to, it felt like being in love and seeking this sort of partnership or any kind of connection outside of oneself during the pandemic was stigmatized, especially to talk about publicly. It's like, who are you seeing during this time? Why are you not, like, you know, socially distancing, even in the name of, you know, like not seeing a partner? Or I literally was spending every single day of the pandemic with the person in the image. And it was kind of a reflection of, you know, something that was continuing to happen that was, you know, I'm sure other people were also experiencing. And I wanted to like have this kind of build community in that from afar even. And that was like the result that, you know, I was wanting to be a part of the image being made public. And I wanted it to, you know, have bold colors that were kind of reflective of the rainbow flag, and just all of these different elements that I wanted to tie back into, you know, like what has become the conversation around being Black, being gay, being queer. Like what makes what are some of the identifiers that like I can like call out, even as like it goes beyond stereotypes. The image, I would say, it goes like of what you would see two men doing. And there was this one one of the bus shelters had an image placed over the faces of the figures in my image that said, this is vulgar, this is repulsive. And I mean, like it was like I was unfazed, but just the act of it, as in opposition to the image, like that's always been a reminder for me of like, there is opposition to this sort of image, and it's just two people kissing, you know? And I mean, it's more than that, but it's like visually, that's what is being opposed. So I want to literally direct people to the conversations that do get stigmatized. And that was like, you know, in the cropping is like very direct, it's very in your face, and a lot of the images that I make are. And I think for many reasons, it's important to have it on this very, very public platform. It's like outside of the educational system. It's like kids get to see this image on, you know, the bus shelters, having the conversations around it. That's another step, but it's all important to see the visual before anything else, I believe.
Pharrelli?
Yeah, so in the same way, I wanted this to be like a boost, a power up for communities of color, for like people I love and know that don't have the luxury of having that moment of isolated rest, who can't go to a park and like just luxuriate in a book. Many people are got sick because of that very gig culture that didn't allow the freedom of space, of personal space and time. So if you had to be that gig worker that had to be taking that bus to an Amazon warehouse to see that moment of luxuriated breath and space, and it could either be a site of mourning or of rejoicing. So to give that freedom and that reflection, and to look back at other, you know, usually Black and Brown protest has to be always consumed as performative and external. And when we even think of like something like the Black Power movement or even the Black Panthers, a lot of times they're militarized, but many of their actions that were probably the most impactful were things like the Free People's Clinic or free breakfasts for children, things that were meant, first of all, to center and heal our own before even like the use of guns was against police brutality then. So following that thread and making room for it in a way that's not protesting as a performative outer thing, but as a inner self-regeneration. So we have all those histories to refer back to and to get forward.
Yeah, I love that idea that that activism is not only the physical act, the performative act, or the representation of that, and that the kind of self-care, whether it's a kind of mourning or whether it's a sort of healing, is really a part of that. Just to want to maybe talk for a moment about these notions of history, because I think sometimes, you know, we can talk about looking back in history as looking at kind of established narratives, which are generally, you know, can often be a part of the process that has been disempowering or has been another aspect of a colonial or colonialist kind of narrative. So, so in a way, is the task as much as anything a kind of, you know, reinventing history or a reimagining history, or like, it's so interesting that both of you dig into, you know, histories of different kinds, but not to replicate the history that people know. It's to sort of invent a different history.
It's almost like having to tell a truer history. And part of it, so there's two aspects of it. One is almost like the Afrofuturist idea of having to make a wild fabulation so you can refract your lens and be able to see potential futures. So the other is the fact that most of the history we've been taught has been storytelling, has been an active turning away of certain facts. Even something like recently I saw this, and it was very trite like meme online, but just thinking of how Native peoples in the Americas had existed in this land for 60,000 years without disrupting it. And, you know, the occupation that's happened in the past 300 years decimated the landscape. In just 300 years, we've decimated this landscape. So recontextualizing ideas of progress, of what it means to be, to advance. Like what is forward motion, and that maybe there is something in between. Like we can't disavow both, and obviously one path is leading us towards destruction. So how do you find ways of maybe looking at that history that's been ignored and putting it closer to the present? Yeah.
Yeah, I look at referencing history in many ways the same way I think about combining all of these different layers and influences in my images. I think about how much of our history has been told by someone who doesn't look like me, and it's supposed to be mine. And ours as Black and queer people collectively. And I see myself providing an alternate, not necessarily factual or fictitious, but I am quite aware that when people see certain images, they can only imagine certain certain positions to take. So for example, I've made an image of, I was included in the slide I showed earlier, but there's an image that I have of someone who is basically in a tree, and you can't see a rope. You can see their eyes through the limbs. Their feet aren't touching the ground. The image is titled, "I'll Be Up There in a Minute." And that's referencing, you know, from the viewer standpoint, the viewer is on the ground, the person is in the tree. Assuming if you're Black, assuming this is another time, if you're looking at this from the perspective of this is a lynching, the title references or implicates you in that moment. But there are alternatives, because you only have so much with the visual. There are other alternatives that I think of when I, you know, want to look at an image of a person in a tree, or am met with an image of a person in the tree. I'm thinking of, you know, the actions, the gestures, even referencing other narratives in history of ascension and levitation, imagined like bodily experiences, outside of just seeing an image of a Black person in a tree, and knowing that the history we have attached to that is the history of lynching and slavery. But that doesn't have to be the only, you know, the only narrative that's there. And that's the case with many of the other images or many visuals that we see when it comes to Blackness and queerness. There's so much that just hasn't even been discovered when it comes to our representation visually. So
yeah, it was interesting to me that I had a great time kind of, you know, biking around the city, looking at all of the different works. And one of the things that sort of struck me was how clearly they were not advertising. That these were really works of art. Like, it was not hard to figure out, like, something else is going on here. And that to me was sort of really interesting to think about when you think about, you know, how images work and what images do, and what the motivation of an image is. And one of the audience questions is kind of asking what it was like to see your work on the streets of New York City,
Mm.
sort of in this way. So love to know how either of you, both of you, sort of felt seeing your work in that different kind of context.
You want to go, Firelei?
Yeah, it's very brief, but it was always fascinating to see how a person's experience could determine the consumption of the image, and what each thing that for me was a symbolic key to different experiences was absorbed differently depending on where you were coming from. And if you just saw it as something beautiful and formal, that was okay. It was a hard time in history. So if you took pleasure out of this image, that was enough for me. But then when you could actually unpack it, that was even better.
Yeah. There were many feelings on my end. One, it was just like the publicity of, me like just publicly announcing my HIV status, and just being vulnerable and knowing that I treat all my images with the sort of care of, being so open, even though all the images are staged. Like when I see an image that I've made in public, like the one on the bus shelter is undetectable, I think about the fact that I think about community, basically. I mean, this is in people's neighborhoods. I'm thinking about all of the people who this might affect, who probably even haven't had the conversation of what they're looking at, to each other, to their children, to their peers. And it brings me, to the point of, okay, I've put this out in the world. I've done the job of doing that. And it's like knowing that this is an exhibition, knowing that this is public. Like a lot of people barely get to go to museums. A lot of people barely can afford to see art. So it's like when you see a work, what are all 50 works? It's like they mean different things to each person who sees them. And when I knew that, the image of myself and the other person in the image was going to be 10 locations, it's like, okay, these are 10 locations that will definitely, open some sort of portal into, like the lives of, more queer and Black narratives. And that was just beautiful for me to just know that I was a part of. And even in people knowing the locations that I didn't know, like the Fulton and J Street area, where my image is across from Elizabeth Bick's image of another non-binary person and their mother, and being told that people are going to flip out when they see this image, because knowing the sort of interactions and reactions that people already have when they see Blackness or queerness like lived out proudly, and like having to navigate that in real life. So when there's like a heavily populated Black community that has an image of two gay Black men kissing in the neighborhood just around the corner, it's like, what do you do? It's like you have to have that conversation if it's that visible, as opposed to, not, so it was a lot of like, wow, this is, has the room to be so impactful to the littlest person who might not even know this is their narrative.
Another question from an audience member was if if both of you could talk a little bit about how the shelter in place sort of affected your work.
Mm.
What was it like to work during that time? Obviously, Pharrelli, we can all see you're in like a gorgeous studio, and but I know you haven't sort of been there the whole time. So anyway, love to just hear a little bit about how this period has sort of affected your working process and approach. Pharrelli, do you want to jump in first?
My work usually is very physical. It starts as like a very gestural pour onto canvas. So it's like 5 gallons of paint being poured onto this wild space, and I don't have to protect the walls. I just put a layer of paint over it and like restart. At home, all the way back in March, I had to decamp and just set up a provisional space at home, and parquet floors and the walls, so lots of tarps still didn't protect it. The work became far more precious, so the handling was a lot tighter. I tend to work fairly fast, so if something is smaller, it gets a bit like the work at PATH, where every part of the space is touched. It's like becomes a mark. There's very little room for openness. So I guess like the enclosure, like the isolation, the paintings became very compact, handled, compressed spaces. So yeah, that's probably why I need here, so I can have room for the figure to move.
And D'Angelo?
I do not have a studio space. I make images wherever I can. But I definitely, as it basically I go months without making work, and spending time indoors or outdoors during a pandemic is like, it's no different than just like living my life and experiencing, the atmosphere around me to continue to make images. I'm like, all of that is time that I use to just like recharge, reflect, and live my life. And I did the same during the pandemic. I made images probably every few months during the pandemic. And it was like, I can't just like churn out. I mean, that's what I was doing in college, and it was just image after image after image, week after week after week. And I was just like, no, this won't be my life. But it's like, there's a pace that I have been, I guess I would say, lucky to have, to be able to make things at my own pace, and like it's helped me. I feel in the execution of those images that I do produce. And I mean, like, of course, there could be a lot that I like could do in a certain amount of time, but also that time is very precious. And I also don't have like this relationship with time or like schedules. And it's more meaningful to me for like things just to come when they come, and not force anything out of a pandemic or force anything out of a moment. And when the opportunity did come to be a part of the Public Art Fund exhibition, it was like, okay, this is like, I'm already thinking these things. We already have these visuals that I'm wanting to relate back to the work that I do make in this short amount of time. But it wasn't so demanding to where it was like, oh, I don't know what I can do in this moment. Like, what is this moment? But it was, it just made sense, and it felt right to use undetectable. Yeah, to make undetectable.
I think we're sort of just about out of time, but maybe a couple of sort of quick questions again from the audience. Pharrelli, someone was wanting to know again the name of the action group that you mentioned.
I'm not sure exactly what they mean. If I did mention the Black Panther group.
That's right. Maybe that was it.
There are many groups of resistance, but I think specifically I mentioned them and their free breakfasts and the Free People's Clinic.
Right. And this is about the complexity of representing activism or rethinking the stereotypes of how that's represented. And D'Angelo, a question for you about sort of how you came up with the idea of the headscarves worn backwards.
That image, which I titled The Lovers, was, my love of surrealism was taking over, and I made that image my second year of grad school, a 3-year program at Syracuse. And it was when I had started to first introduce other queer Black men in the images with me. And I was referencing, in particular, René Magritte's painting of the same name, The Lovers. And in that image, 2 figures, or what looks to be 2 figures, embracing, kissing, have this white cloth over their heads. And I assume the figures in that painting are male, female, man, woman. And I wanted to treat the image that I wanted to make and to have the conversation around Black intimacy, queer intimacy. But I wanted to look at materials that are more common to the Black community. And the headscarves that I use are do-rags that are worn the opposite way of how they're worn in the image, but I wanted to use them as veils, like the veils that you would usually use during marriage or like a wedding ceremony. But it was a way to like turn make an alternate use for the material itself, which is known to like protect and texturize hair, Black people's hair. And so it was a lot of looking at these things that were just a part of my daily life and accessible. When of course I could have used a pillowcase, but I also wanted to like have this sort of representation of who we were looking at in the image. So yeah, like that was kind of how the image came to be, or how I ended up using the do-rags.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much to both of you, I think, for kind of revealing at least some of kind of the layers and the meanings that are embedded in the imagery that both of you work with in so many different ways, and for your willingness to kind of embrace the idea of doing this work at such short notice for public space, for bus shelters, for digital screens, and just sort of being up for that adventure and challenge. And I think also for doing something that is really hard, which is to create moments of intimacy in public space. I think one of the really beautiful things with sort of what you've both achieved and many of your colleagues as well has been these moments of real intimacy and connection. So congratulations to both of you. Thank you so much for joining in today. Thanks everyone who's participated for joining us. And we'll be back later in the fall with Sam Moyer's talk. We'll send you info about that. Her show just opened. But for now, please well, let me extend my thanks sort of on behalf of everybody. Firelei Báez, D'Angelo Lovell Williams. Great to see you guys.